My title, you can see there, is Diversity Between Deconstruction and Evidence. I'm afraid it sounds a bit philosophical, and then you guess right, I'm a philosopher. I hope it won't be too abstract and too difficult. Rather than talking mostly about what is diversity or what to do with it, I would like to invite you to think a bit together, to come into a process of thinking about the very concept of diversity, about the word and its uses. That means I will ask why at all shall we account for diversity in general, and what are the uses of the concept? What does that concept mean? What are possible uses? What can that concept mean? This way? The next one? Yeah. Yep. In order to answer the first question, why shall we account for diversity in general, I will refer to multiple rationales for diversity as you can find in the work of Andy Sterling. Andy Sterling is Professor for Science and Technology Policy at the University of Sussex, and he's an expert for diversity analysis. And in, I think it was 2008, Andy Sterling delivered a report about diversity concepts, about diversity politics, and about cultural diversity to the Assembly of the United Nations. Perhaps you know, during these years, 2006, 2008 until 2011, the UN discussed all these contracts about cultural diversity, and this contract known as GATS, G-A-T-S. And all these discussions, all these debates had been in these years, and Andy Sterling was this expert for diversity to this UN assembly. And Andy Sterling told us there are many reasons for appreciating social, cultural, economic, technological, all these sorts of diversity. Why shall we appreciate thinking about diversity in general? And here are the answers given by Andy Sterling. He tells us there are many advantages in accounting for diversity. By accounting for diversity as a first point, you are going to reflect about contexts. Why? Diversity allows sensitivity to heterogeneous conditions, he tells us. Thinking about minority cultures when it comes to cultural diversity, thinking about ecological niches, about geographical loci, and so on. Thinking about diversity in general means reflecting about contexts, allows for sensitivity to very heterogeneous conditions, and that can be seen as a value in its own. Secondly, thinking about or accounting for diversity fosters innovation, as Sterling tells us. Diverse configurations and relations can stimulate creativity. I suppose you know by own experience. Perhaps I should go a bit quicker into this. The third advantage Sterling talks about is that accounting for diversity mitigate lock-ins. That means diverse portfolios resist pressures to concentrate. And that means there's a very political sense of appreciating diversity. Appreciating diversity can resist oligopoly, can resist entrapment, can resist monocultures, can resist hegemony. Fourth, accounting for diversity can hedge ignorance. I suppose you will agree that's as well a value perhaps on its own. Perhaps you know this saying, it's better to have your eggs in different baskets, and it's better not to have all your eggs only in one basket. And that's Sterling uses for explaining that accounting for diversity can hedge ignorance, can reduce impacts of unforeseen risks or vulnerabilities or shocks. The fifth advantage he accounts for is that diversity can promote resilience. Diversity can offer a response pool for adaptive strategies. And diversity, the last reason he gives us here, can accommodate dissent because diversity can help reconcile plural values and interests. We just heard one example for that in that lecture delivered by Berta, the first lecture. It's a good example where at the end this petition asks for accommodating dissent in order to help getting further in these uses of diversity that are so important in sustainability discussions. Thus, according to Sterling, there are many rationales, many advantages of accounting for diversity, but there are many difficulties as well. The first, quite simple difficulty is that diversity is a notion with many various meanings, and perhaps it's just a reminder here, all of you will know that, but there are many various meanings of diversity and they are often confounded, and then it can be even politically dangerous if you confound various meanings and don't look thoroughly what meaning you use at the moment. First, on the level on fields and subject matters, it's quite easy to see. All of you will know there are such things as biodiversity. We heard about there is social diversity, there is cultural diversity, there's of course economic diversity on various levels. There's technological diversity, and I suppose you can make this a much bigger list in adding other sorts, other versions of diversity. That means diversity on the first hand is a notion with various meanings when it comes to the level of fields and subject matters. But there's another level as well, and there's a second question: how do we perceive diversity in general? What does it mean to perceive diversity? What is diversity when we come to experience diversity? How do we perceive, how do we notice, how do we measure diversity? And here I refer to Andy Sterling, who has done a lot of work about this question: how do we measure, for example, cultural diversity? And the first very important point I would like to make here is Sterling's point that diversity is inherently an aggregate or a system-level property. What does that mean? That means you cannot say of a single element of a class or of a single element of a group of things that this exactly this element is diverse in itself. You cannot take one thing. Imagine I've a group or 10 pencils like this one, and you look at these pencils and say, oh, this one is especially diverse. The others aren't. This one is diverse in itself. And it sounds a bit strange, sounds a bit funny. That's meant when saying diversity is an aggregate or system level property. You talk about systems, you talk about groups, you don't talk about single elements that have the feature of being diverse, but you're always talking about a system or a group or a class of things. That means it's sort of complicated, and by talking about this example of cultural diversity, I would try to explain this a little bit further. That's my example now, talking on behalf of Faculty of Culture. What is cultural diversity? And you can think about what is cultural diversity by thinking about how to increase cultural diversity. If we would like to increase cultural diversity, you can think about how diversity can be increased, and there you can find that diversity can be increased in 3 different ways. Imagine see this circle here with the smaller circles in it. Imagine a field, for example, the field of culture with such subfields as literature or music, film, art, theater, dance, opera, and all these things in it. Imagine this circle as a field, the field of cultures entailing all these subfields. And then you can think about how the diversity of this given field can be increased. And it can be, now that's the point, it can be increased in 3 different ways. And these 3 different ways tell us a lot about the concept of diversity itself. Because the first way we can increase diversity, the first way is in the sense of increasing variety. You see here this upper circle entails more elements than the circle below. That means it's an increasing sense of variety because you have an increasing number of genres in the mix entailed in the circle. That means you can talk of diversity in terms of variety. Diversity can mean variety, but there are other senses as well. The second sense, the second way we can think of increasing diversity is in the sense of balance. Then we're talking of the evenness in allocations. Yeah. That's right. See this circles given here, and no. Where's the second? Here, it was a bit slowly. Here, you can see the second sense in these 2 circles below. You can watch, there is no evenness in allocations, and if we want to increase diversity in this left circle, we can increase the evenness in allocations, and here you can see the allocation is even other than in the circle on the right. That means it's another sense of diversity. When talking about diversity, it may mean variety, but it may mean as well balance. And of course, balance and variety are very different concepts, and you shouldn't confound that. And still, there's even a third way we can think about increasing diversity, not only in terms of variety or in terms of balance, but third, in terms of disparity. We can increase diversity as well in the sense of increasing disparity, and that means the degree of differences. You can perhaps think about how we could change this last circle in order to increase the diversity in the sense of disparity. And here this image is chosen this way to show that here the diversity of the elements in the circle has been increased by terms of disparity. These elements you see here now differ more than before. Okay, so far about very many different levels. First, in terms of fields and subject matters, and second here in terms of the very concept of diversity itself. You can think of diversity in terms of variety, in terms of balance, and in terms of disparity. And now, my second idea, based on these thoughts about the concept of diversity, is that you can think about diversity between, that was the title at the beginning, between deconstruction or between construction and evidence. What does that mean? Perhaps I have to explain, and I try to explain it very short. I suppose you can read some explanations of mine on Wednesday, the day after tomorrow, in the Startwochen newsletter. But here I'll try to explain it very, very short. Between, what does it mean, think about diversity between construction or deconstruction and evidence? First, the constructivist stance. on the one hand, we can think of diversity as a result of social construction when it comes to social diversity or cultural diversity as well. You can say it is a matter of our socially constructed identities, for example, race, that we are all human. There's something universal about all of us being here in this lecture hall. We are all human, but some of us perhaps identify with one ethnicity or another. Perhaps some of us thus don't at all identify with one ethnicity or with several, and so on. That means we can talk here about our socially constructed identities. Other examples, of course, are the sort of person we become in our workplace, in the context of one's religion, or when identified by gender and raised as a typical member of that gender group. Many examples of sorts of diversity that can be seen as results of social construction. And of course, these categories became real because they are acted upon again and again. That's why we talk about performative repetition and reiteration. That means repetition again and again. We can read and find this in the works of the philosopher Judith Butler, who has done great work about the impact of this performative repetition of categories of the sort of person we are in terms of race and class and gender and so on. Thanks. A little bit time left. Thanks a lot. Of course, these categories, these identity categories, when socially constructed, they can be deconstructed or destructed as well. We could discuss hours about or days about, but I promise to give you the second the thoughts on the second hand. On the one hand, we can say diversity is the result of social construction, but on the other hand, we can say, oh no, diversity is not only socially constructed, diversity is there in the world. We can experience diversity, and we come to see diversity. There are evidences of diversity, and you can call this attitude the realist stance. The realist stance that would say diversity is something I feel, diversity is something I can experience when coming to know people, perhaps with names I can't pronounce, or with people I feel strange to them, and so on. These are not only social constructions, these are real experiences. And that's why we can talk of evidence here. All these identity categories are to some extent real because they affect how people treat us and how we conceive of ourselves as subjects. And things in the world happen, real things happen because of these social constructions. And these social constructions lead to experiences of evidence. Experiences of evidence that I do experience something and I don't feel it's a result of a social construction. In everyday life, I see and I experience people with different, various ethnicities, genders, classes, and so on. That's the realist stance. Now you can take, on the one hand, the constructivist or the realist stance, and the idea I would like to argue for. The idea is you cannot give solution independent of contexts. Which of these theories, these two big theories, is right? It's never to be decided independent of contexts, whether diversity is more something according to the constructivist or more to the realist stance. We can see this, and that's my last point. We can see this when thinking about politics of difference, politics of diversity. Of course, you know, there can be very dangerous uses of diversity or of refusing diversity. thanks. I think everybody knows there is a bad sense of universalism when important differences between people are neglected or oppressed. For example, when you say all humans are equal, and if this sentence is used, for example, in an anti-feminist sense, then this sentence, all humans are equal, what is of course a very progressive, a very good sentence when uttered in the context of accounting for human rights, can be used in a bad sense of universalism. That is then oppressive or neglects important differences between people. But on the other hand, of course, there can be a bad sense of diversity as well. When diversity when the concept is used, when there are differences perceived or ascribed differences ascribed to people, and they are used in order to exclude or discriminate against people. The most recent example is, of course, the recent debates about refugees and migrants, and these debates are, of course, connected with all these right-wing uses of diversity that can be very dangerous when these right-wing uses of diversity uses the concept of diversity to argue for exclusion or discrimination against people. Perhaps you can think of the German new right-wing politicians that are in debates now, or of the French Nouvelle Droite or other political movements like this. Can be seen very dangerous uses of diversity. And my time is always gone, almost gone. I would like to end with a recommended reading, a book I would like to recommend for your lecture. Jacques Derrida is a French philosopher, he died, is a French philosopher, and Elisabeth Roudinesco, a French psychoanalytic, and they made together a book of dialogues. For What Tomorrow? A Dialogue is the English title. I show you here the German title, because the German title of the book, because it entails this beautiful picture of these two persons. And in this book, highly recommended, you will find a dialogue about what they call the politics of difference. And that's exactly a discussion, very accessible, not too difficult, a very accessible dialogue, short and accessible dialogue about what they call the politics of difference, and that is the politics of diversity. I will end. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Hobuß. Again, I would like to ask for one or two questions from the audience, if there are any, and if I can get a mic. Thank you. Any questions for Professor Hobuß?
Hello, thank you for your contribution. I was wondering, actually, the part where you said the realist here. Hello.
Thanks.
The realist,
sorry.
Yeah, no problem. The realist stance and the constructivist approach. Is it actually, or can we understand it as the realist approach as an answer, or like a continuance of the constructivist? Because when we say, if one say, like, for example, this world or the social sphere is constructed, the outcome it has on the individuals is actually real and in fact evidence-based, or we can measure it. So is it like a continuance of it, or do we have to see it as like two, like maybe excluding schools?
it's again, I can say on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm always talking like this, I'm afraid. On the one hand, of course, the constructivist and the realist approaches are two independent, different sociological and philosophical schools. But here in this field, when talking about diversity and, for example, talking about class, about gender, about race, there you can see this realist approach as an answer to the constructivist approach, perhaps to a period in discussion during the 80s and 90s, 1990s, where the constructivist approach was very dominant. And then, perhaps you know, I think you should know this saying, many people, many scholars doing critical race studies said as an answer to this constructivist approach, okay, race does not exist. The concept of race describes something that doesn't exist in a biological sense. There is no such thing as races in humans. But though the concept of race does not exist, it does kill people. That means that's the real impact. Though the concept of race does not exist, but it does but it does kill people in this very short form. You have got both the realist and the constructivist stance, and I think that's a good idea of thinking about that. And here you can say how this new realist account is really an answer to a period where the constructivist understanding had been dominating the discussions. And now there are things like new materialism or new realism, all approaches in scholarship that are reactions to this period of constructivist approaches. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.